I'm Steph H. Barker and this is a Bookish Topics video. Today I'm going to be talking about books that I grew up with. Number 1, Harry Potter. So, Harry Potter actually got me into reading. Up until I read the series, I'd sort of just really read because it was expected at school. I'd never read a fantasy book before Harry Potter. I'd never read a book series that went on so long, and I'd never read anything that had such an amazing world that you could just get drawn into. Up until then, I just assumed that you wrote in this world. You wrote about stories that were happening here. I never imagined you could make your own world up. Also, the characters were going through things that you could relate to. Like in the first book, Harry Potter was worrying about, going into a new school. And when I first started reading it, I was going into secondary school, so I could relate to him on that level. This book series brought us Ron and Hermione, the best love story ever. And also it brought us discussion. You know, I remember being in secondary school and sitting with my mates and saying, oh my god, what's going to happen in the next book? Who's Harry going to end up with? Is he going to go out with Ginny? Are they going to get back together? What's going to happen? And I don't think there's ever been a book series that I can think of anyway that has touched that many people. You were weird if you hadn't read it. Number 2, The Magic Apostrophe. I think it might just be a Welsh book. I'm not even sure if it's published in the rest of the UK. The premise really interested me when I picked it up, and I was probably about 10 or 11. It's about a girl basically who finds out on her 13th birthday that she's a witch and that all of her aunts are witches, and there's this other world as well that is sort of run by witches essentially. And I don't think the book is necessarily followed through with that premise very well. I don't think the plot is particularly great, but I kept reading it because of the initial premise, and it's probably quite heavily influenced my current work in progress actually, because I kind of read this and I thought, well actually I wouldn't have done that. If I had a character who was going through this, I would have done this. It was probably the first book I read that made me think, maybe I could actually write a book like this. It also got me into a love of all things sort of witchy and magical, and that love is still with me today. Number 3, Jacqueline Wilson books. Now, I can't really pick one book. You can't see, but on my bookshelf I have got a ton of Jacqueline Wilson books. Again, I think she might just be a UK author, but she writes from people about age 8 up to sort of 15. I still read them now actually, and this is one of her later ones, and by later I mean it's for older kids. I think this is probably for 12 to 14 year olds. And this series in particular, the Girls in Love series, I absolutely adored growing up. Jacqueline Wilson's characters are just so interesting, and they're going through normal everyday situations, but she somehow manages to add her own sort of twist to them so that you always remember each character and what was happening. You know, for anyone who may know her, you know, some of my favourites of hers are The Illustrated Mum, the Tracy Beaker series, Double Act. I think as well something about this book series was reading them, I thought, she's got to be a teenager. She can't be writing this accurately as a young person if she's not a young person. But Jacqueline Wilson, even when she was writing this, I mean, she must be in her 70s now at least, so you know, this is only 15 years ago or something. And again, that gave me the realisation of you don't actually have to write as your age. You can write as completely different ages. You could be a completely different sex or race or anything. Number 4, Noughts and Crosses by Malorie Blackman. I love this book, and I would tell anyone who asks me about it to read it, but I've only actually read it once. I was, I think, probably 16. One of my best mates at the time, who was a guy who I also had a big crush on, suggested I read this book. So I thought, okay, yeah, I'll give it a read. And I could not put it down. It was amazing. It's sort of a retelling of Romeo and Juliet, but instead of being a Capulet and a Montague, Callum is a Nought, which basically means he's white, and Stephenie is a cross and she's black. And crosses are sort of in charge of society and Noughts are sort of the servants. As children, they're sort of friends and they end up falling in love, and they end up getting separated through society, and the ending is just not at all what you would expect, but it really opens your eyes to your sort of views on race. The ending of this book is not happy, and this is the first book I read that had a sad ending. The ending is so upsetting that I literally sobbed and grieved for at least 2 weeks. I couldn't read anything after I read this, and I've read the one after this, but I haven't finished the series because you finish this book and you're just already feeling down, and then it just gets worse and worse. Number 5, The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. This was the first sort of book series that I came across that didn't have the traditional point of view. And what I mean by that is the person who is narrating the story isn't a character. We're not in the characters' heads at all. It's sort of this distant, almost God look on what's happening. And as it says, you know, in the book series, it's about Narnia, it's not about the characters. And I'd never realised you could tell a story that way. So that was a big eye-opener for me. And also, it was just, again, such an interesting world, and it really inspired me just to write and create worlds. And I just loved this series. It really was one of those series that you just couldn't put down. It was just so interesting. Number 6, A Series of Unfortunate Events by Lemony Snicket. Now this I read probably when I was in primary school, and it was the first book that I came across that was dark. As you obviously know from the title, it's not going to be a barrel of laughs. Every time something good happens, something bad seems to happen. But the reason that I enjoyed this series and kept reading was because it really pushed your expectation of a protagonist. The characters just stay strong. They don't moan, they just continue on as a unit, as a family. And it was just really interesting to see what situations they could end up in and how they're going to cope with that. And also, you know, the situations that they do get into are so imaginative and so interesting. And there's sort of almost a Sherlock Holmes element to them because there's like a mystery underlining it. Number 7, His Dark Materials by Phillip Pullman. Each book is like a separate entity. The first book, we're in this completely different world. We've got Lyra as the main character, and there's this big mystery of kids going missing, and it's just amazing. I loved that world. I loved the situation. The writing is so smart. Phillip Pullman didn't feel like he had to dumb it down for kids, which is great. And because of that, adults read it as well. I loved the second book as well with Will, and the third book just blew my mind. Number 8, Any Book by Roald Dahl. Even though I've just said any book, I don't actually own any book by Roald Dahl. They're probably at my mum's house, I imagine, probably in a box that says Steph Childhood or something like that, but they're not here anyway. Roald Dahl books are just amazing. Growing up, I think if it hadn't been for them, I wouldn't have an imagination, because they teach you, you know, that girls can befriend giants, there are witches in the world. They teach you all these amazing things that are probably lessons for completely different things that happen in real life, but they're sort of translated in a way that we can understand. There were no bounds to Roald Dahl's imagination, and there was these sort of nightmarish elements to them as well, but the stories were intriguing, the characters were interesting, and they were just such great books to grow up with. Number 9, Twilight by Stephenie Meyer. Some people might think, what the hell is Twilight doing in there? I mean, I read Twilight probably when I was 16, so it's not really a growing up book, but if it hadn't been for Twilight, I probably wouldn't have progressed onto all the other things that I've progressed onto with my reading, because this was the first young adult fantasy fiction that I'd read, and I only read it because my sister had read it. Reading it, I just thought, this is actually quite similar to the sort of things that I write about and I imagine, and so it just sort of led on to other things. And I think in terms of films especially, it was sort of a new dawn for young adult fiction, especially young adult fantasy fiction, and after that there was just so many of them, and there were so many interesting things to read. When I first read this, it was so exciting, you know, the whole mortal and vampire falling in love. It hadn't been done since Dracula. It was a complete reinvention, and I liked the fact that she reinvented the vampires. And, you know, reading it now you think, God, this has been done so much, but at the time it hadn't been done. It was new, it was fresh. You get into sort of halfway through New Moon and Edward's gone, suddenly Bella becomes this really interesting character, and you get to see how she's dealing with him leaving her, and then it's just so exciting, it's so interesting. The last book in the series was a disappointment to me. It all just seemed a bit convenient the way it wrapped up. Now I'm just going to apologise now for the fact that the camera keeps moving. I think it's probably chopped my head off at some point or another. But that's all I've got today. This is a really long video, I know that, so I'm sorry for that, but I had to talk about all those books. They're my growing up books. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. If you've got a video where you're talking about your growing up books, please link it below, or equally, if you've got any books that you think, how did I not read growing up, please comment about them below, and thanks very much.